Good evening, everybody. My name is David Sproles, and I'm the president of the New York School of Interior Design, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here this evening for the talk, Reimagining the Havana Home, Authentic Cuban Style, Past, Present, and Future, with our guest, Hermes Mallea. Since 2010, Hermes has been working with a handful of Cuban photographers to document Havana's rich architectural history, which obviously was interrupted by the revolution in 1959. Tonight, we are lucky to get a peek behind the scenes as Hermes shows us landmark houses constructed between 1860 and 1960. You'll also find these homes in Hermes's book, Great Houses of Havana, which you are fortunate enough to be able to purchase in the back after the talk. So, we also have your other book, Escapes, right? Two get in the back. So. Let me tell you a little bit about Hermes. Having published 3 books on the topic, he's an expert in the style and culture of pre-1960s Havana. He's presented his books at, among other venues, the Houston Museum of Fine Arts, the Americas Society, and the Winterthur Museum. Beyond his books, he's presented research on historic photographs of domestic interiors at the Cooper Hewitt Museum, the University of Miami School of Architecture, and the Bildner Center's International Cuba Symposium at the City University of New York. M Group, the interiors and architecture practice that Hermes co-founded with Carrie Maloney in 1983, has received numerous awards, including the Friends of the Upper East Side Historic District's Residential Restoration Award. Now, I could go on, but I know that we are here to see beautiful images and to hear a fascinating talk. So, Hermes, it's all yours.
Hi. Well, thank you. I'm pleased to be at the New York School of Interior Design, one of the country's finest and first academic institutions focused on interior design. And I can't help but think of your success as you celebrate your centennial. And as I watch Cuba's design educators and design community struggle to figure out what their whole place in the changes that we're hoping are headed to the island will be. So as David mentioned, I've been studying Havana for almost 10 years, and tonight I'm going to talk to you about the past, the present, and the future of design in Cuba based solely on my personal observations. We'll begin with a look at Havana's historic architecture, especially created between 1860 and 1960, as featured in my original book, Great Houses of Havana. Next, I'm going to give you a preview of my upcoming book, Havana Living Today, which will be published in September, and today is what the book is all about. And finally, I'm going to share with you some examples of what I think is Havana style to come and tell you a little bit about the people who are helping to define this new aesthetic. So I'll warn you, I'm packing in a lot, but I hope you'll find it informative. So since December of 2015, news of Cuba has been pretty inescapable. After 50 years of alienation with the United States, President Obama and his family visited the island, and the president reestablished diplomatic relations and even suspended the wet foot, dry foot immigration policy. Recent reforms by the Cuban government have allowed all kinds of new private enterprises. And as a result, Cuban architects are actually dealing with private clients for the first time in 50 years. The buying and selling of real estate is also now permitted by the Cuban government, and sales prices are being tracked by interested Cubans in a variety of websites. Now, following the death of Fidel, I watched the grieving heads of state from Latin America, Asia, and Africa pay homage to this leader from what I thought was just a small Caribbean island, but who had somehow wielded international influence for almost 50 years. In the last years, Cuba's artists have been enjoying record-breaking prices at art fairs like Miami's Art Basel and at international auction houses. And Cuban ingenuity, which we know of from their recycling of those 1950s cars that are so popular there, is being applied to the spotty internet with the creation of an alternate distribution system known as El Paquete Semanal, a weekly package, they call it, which is a thumb drive basically containing all kinds of information that they share every week. It's all about connecting the island to the rest of the world. And speaking of those connections, we've had some interesting cultural events in Havana in the last year, capitalizing on this international interest in the city. A scene from the Chanel fashion show, which was kind of controversial. Less controversial was the Rolling Stones concert and the filming of the latest of the Fast and Furious series of movies. Well, I'm constantly struck by the fascination that the island of Cuba has exerted historically around the world, by the mystique that's always been associated with that little purple island. So that Cuba feels so much bigger in our perception than I think makes sense given its limited physical size. When I returned to Cuba for the first time in 40 years, I brought a series of mental cliches with me. Images of Havana, for example, including the concept that Havana had been frozen in time in 1959. In researching my first book, I had to reconcile those many preconceptions with the rich reality that I found every time that I visited the island. So in the book, I describe Cuba's westward expansion in a series of historic neighborhoods, beginning all the way to the right here in Old Havana, which was the original walled city. And these neighborhoods all provide a context for the exceptional residential architecture that I present in the book. Now, I get a kick out of American audiences being surprised to recognize in Havana's houses the architectural styles that they're familiar with from places like Palm Beach or Newport or Los Angeles. But it's important to recognize that Cuba followed step by step what was going on in the international design scene. And today, Havana's houses form a little known yet incredibly rich archive of every significant architectural style of the 20th century, with excellent examples of Beaux-Arts classicism, all the eclectic revival styles, Art Deco, and of course, some very interesting international style modernism. Now, as a designer, I know that the best houses are always an articulation of the personality of the people who live in them. So when I created my book, I made a real effort to put the builder's personality and let's say, description front and center when looking at the houses that they created in Havana. And I think it's not an exaggeration to say that every one of the houses has, at its core, a very interesting personal story, with standouts like Jane Mason, seen all the way to the left in a photograph by Cecil Beaton, of course, Papa Hemingway, and the larger-than-life Countess of Revilla de Camargo. What I'd like you to take away tonight is an appreciation for the sophistication of life in Havana between 1860 and 1960, at a time when the city was called the Paris of the Americas, and the sugar wealth that financed the construction of the very interesting houses that I feature in the book was also used to make the city beautiful, as you see here, with a series of landscaped avenues, monumental public buildings, and very grand social clubs. So my book spans this period, as I say, between 1860 and 1960, a period when American influence on Cuba's culture was really growing exponentially, especially within the middle and the upper classes. And I began in 1860 with this house, the Palace of the Counts of Santovenia, a grand house illustrating the sophistication of Cuban taste at the time. It was furnished, as you see here, in an abundance of furniture, fabrics, artworks, imported both from Europe and from the United States. Luxury goods which were found in abundance in Havana's warehouses, docks, and markets, and had been brought to the city by the hundreds of ships, as you see here, which had been clogging Havana's harbor since the days of the Spanish treasure fleet 200 years before that. Architecturally, the Santovenia Palace that I showed you represents the typical Cuban adaptation of the Spanish patio house, a design that the Spaniards built all over Latin America. And it's a design that worked well within the confines of the walled city, which you see highlighted in red here, as a way of dealing with the intense heat of Havana. Now, the grand colonial houses of Havana reflect the enormous prosperity that was being enjoyed in the mid-19th century by a handful of families who had controlled the island's economy for generations. And when I speak about that wealth and that economy, it's impossible to do that without acknowledging the centuries of African slavery or slave labor that actually sustained that economy. Now, many of us forget that the U.S. occupied Cuba between 1898 and 1902. And this historic moment is represented in a series of buildings, a stock exchange, for example, a train station there were banks, there were office buildings, created in an area that we can almost consider a little Wall Street in Havana. And these buildings were often designed by American architects. They were often put up by American construction companies who were working in Havana, and they were usually financed by American investors or speculators who looked on Havana as a nearby frontier where they could make a fortune and then leave rather quickly. So these early days of the Cuban Republic are associated or represented by a series of urban mansions that were built on the Paseo del Prado, which is a landscape boulevard that you see highlighted in red. As you see, it's just outside of the confines of the walled city. And with this move out of the walled city and to the Prado, Havana's elite begins this westward journey that I mentioned as they occupy one more fashionable and progressively more exclusive neighborhood after another. And essentially, they're leaving behind the chaos of the port and the cigar factories and the warehouses and all that din. The Paseo del Prado houses, and as you see here, are characterized by public arcades at the ground level. And at the second floor, you have the balconies or loggias that are associated with the family life, and they're overlooking the life of that landscaped boulevard and allowing the salons up above to enjoy views of the Prado gardens that were in the center. Now, a representative Prado house is seen here. It was the mansion built by a former president of Cuba, Jose Miguel Gomez, and you get an idea of the sort of the level of decoration that was being applied to the interiors. The Prado was the premier boulevard of Republican Havana, as we call it, and here you would find the best hotels, the theaters, the cafes, places where the likes of Sarah Bernhardt, Caruso, Isadora Duncan would have performed. So now we come to a milestone in Cuba's history at the end of World War I, when the European beet fields were decimated by the war, and Cuba essentially became the world's leading sugar producer. And the result is called the sugar boom in Cuba, and it's associated with yet another westward move, in this case to the coastal neighborhood of Vedado. It's a planned neighborhood, so that's unusual. And the grid, as you can see there, is slightly tilted, and it's oriented to take advantage of the prevailing breezes coming off the ocean. Now, the developers of the Vedado provided all the infrastructure, all the sewer, water, telephone, electrical lines underneath the neighborhood, so it assured that the Vedado houses were actually equipped with the most modern comforts. And the other thing that happened is that there's a new housing type that develops according to the zoning of the neighborhood. So you have a front garden. The houses essentially are set back behind a front garden, set back from the street behind a front porch, and they're individual, they're freestanding, so there's windows all around, and that lets them get rid of the courtyard at the center because you can ventilate it all from the outside. So as world sugar prices are going through the roof, the planters and the mill owners and the bankers and politicians are enjoying a never-before-seen lavish lifestyle. And of course, they build mansions in that Vedado neighborhood that express their individuality. In this case, a beautiful Second Empire-style house. We have all the eclectic revivals, brother and sister pair of houses with green tile roof, a wonderful Florentine Renaissance pair of tower houses, very eclectic house that was the home of a prominent Havana architect who was said to take clients around the house and ask them to point out details that they liked because he sort of essentially had every style that he could work in incorporated into the exterior. Now, rooms like this in today's Napoleonic Museum give you a sense of the scale of the interiors and how they really were in sync with the grandeur of the exteriors. The more generous building lots in this Vedado neighborhood permitted an ingenious experimentation, exploration really, of indoor-outdoor connections in a series of new porches and pergolas and winter gardens which, of course, because of the climate, were really where people spent most of their time. And so it's logical that designers lavished attention on these spaces connected to the exterior, creating places with inlaid marble floors, beautiful woodwork, as you see, ironwork. And one thing that's new, which is the creation or the inclusion of a garden that was designed by a professional and that was really meant to actually extend the interior out into nature. Now, the most inventive example of what I would call this new architecture of leisure was this exquisitely detailed, as you see here, indoor swimming pool wing known as the Roman bath of the Mendoza family. And this architecture of leisure is also reflected in a series of American-inspired social clubs where Havana's elite gathered for activities like tennis or squash or yachting or rowing. This is the Vedado Tennis Club. The sugar prosperity that was used to build these houses was also used to finance some interesting public works projects that were seen as integral to Havana's self-image as a world-class capital. The French landscape architect Jean-Claude Nicolas Forestier was brought from Paris to create a network of paseos and parks and urban spaces that reinforced the city's monumental image. And in this case, for example, Forestier designed the steps up to the University Acropolis, which, as you can see, is very reminiscent of Columbia University. Forestier also was able to work with the National Capitol building as well as the presidential palace, so they occupied, let's call them, starring roles in his design. And all of his work was finished in time for the 1929 visit to Havana of the American president Calvin Coolidge, whom you see at the left, kind of a sour-looking fellow. He was there as part of the Pan American Conference, where Cuba was said to take her place as a hemispheric capital of the Caribbean. Now, Havana's appropriation of international styles of architecture continues next with the Art Deco style of the 1920s. And use of the Art Deco in Cuba connected Havana's home and business owners to what was happening around the rest of the world. So connection to what's going on internationally is important to our self-image. Havana's beloved Bacardi building is a unique polychrome presence in the city's skyline. But in Havana, if you say Art Deco, everybody thinks of the house of legendary lovers Catalina Lassa and Juan Pedro Baró, whose affair scandalized society. They escaped to Paris, where they lived in very wealthy exile for about a decade. And for their return to Havana, they brought essentially the top practitioners of the Parisian Art Deco style that they had just witnessed at the famous expo. And so we have designers like Lalique and Baguez and Dominique who created a unique setting for the couple to reintroduce themselves to Havana, employing these boldly colored marbles, absolutely cutting-edge use of indirect lighting, and all kinds of beautiful metal and stonework. Now, in the late 1920s, Havana again captures the American imagination with its music and its sensuous glamour, and it becomes the destination of choice for American tourists seeking a good time without the limitations or restrictions of prohibition. So Cuban and American developers began to build a series of bathhouses, casinos, racetracks, all employing a Mediterranean or a Spanish revival style that had worked really well in Coral Gables or Palm Beach to sort of enhance, let's call it, the exotic allure of a Cuban holiday. The American tourism promoter, John Bowman, brought horse racing to Havana in an effort to create a winter home for the northeastern horse racing circuit. He built a racetrack, a jockey club. He refurbished the National Casino. To the left, we have the Hotel Nacional de Cuba, the national hotel of the country, which was created by McKimmey and White. And to the right, we have the Sevilla Biltmore, which was built by John Bowman, and to a design by Schultz and Weaver of New York. Now, Havana's most exclusive neighborhood, both then as well as now, is called the Country Club Estates. And it was created around a golf course and clubhouse around 1911 by American and British investors. As you see from the box there, and if you think of the upper right-hand corner as the original walled city, we're about as far as you can possibly get from the original core of the city and still be a part of it. But it was all about being disconnected, because behind the gates of these winding tree-lined avenues, you find pretty much every example possible of styles of the 20th century architecture. And I would say that 99% of these mansions were expropriated by the government at the time of the revolution. There are a couple where the original families actually still live. But today, this is a neighborhood of the casas de protocolo, or diplomatic guest houses, or foreign ambassadors' residences, places where foreign dignitaries are entertained, as I say, as well as the residence of foreign ambassadors. This, interestingly, is being rented out to a Cuban-Venezuelan art collector, and she's really installed a very interesting, let's call it Bel Air style decoration. Now, among the luxurious houses that were built in that neighborhood, really one of the standouts was the home of the U.S. ambassador, and it was built during the 1940s with the goal of being our most impressive foreign residence in the Americas. Remember that at the time, the American ambassador was pretty much regarded as the number 2 man on the island after the Cuban president. Here we see a very evocative picture of the wife of the next to the last ambassador, Earl T. Smith, doing the flowers in the vast entrance hall of the residence. Now, during the final years before the 1959 revolution, Havana was experiencing a building boom related to tourism. So this is a time when you can almost think of there being 2 Havanas that rarely overlapped. To the left, you have the sophisticated lifestyle of the Cuban elite, and to the right, we have a representation of what's called the rum and rumba tourism that was heading south from the United States. Now, in order to receive those guests, we have, for example, the Hotel Riviera, which at the time was the most modern hotel in the Caribbean, reminiscent, of course, of Morris Lapidus's work in Miami Beach. And in order to give these hotels, and there were a series of them, this is an interior from the Hilton, in order to give them a local identity, the hotel designers called on Cuban craftsmen, Cuban artists, to insert artwork or themes. This, for example, is a dining room of the Hilton built around the theme of sugar cane. So this is the Havana, really, that we all know. The late 50s, the star-studded floor shows at Tropicana with Liberace or Harry Belafonte or Nat King Cole. Of course, the Mafia. There were 13 gambling casinos at the time. It was definitely a place where it was best to leave your inhibitions at home. Now, the 1950s are associated with a series of residential neighborhoods, let's call them suburban neighborhoods, in Havana. Miramar was one of them, very stretched out along the sea, always with this feeling of being very connected to the sea, to the extent that the daughter of the man posed there told me that he caught that fish while casting off his backyard into the water there. But so the lives in Miramar of people really had, I would say, a decidedly American flavor. They, went to bilingual schools. They traveled to the United States. And the houses in a neighborhood like Miramar were contemporary, but not too daring, and would not, as you see, have been out of place in an American suburb of the 1950s. But really, the most inventive houses of the 1950s were the Cuban interpretations of international style modernism as guided by the island's centuries of home building traditions. So following years and years of adapting international styles to the local tastes and conditions, Cuban designers found it was possible to be true to their contemporary ideals and still be grounded in tradition. And the result were wonderful buildings like this animated design apartment building in Miramar with an emphasis on expressing the construction materials, on providing natural ventilation, and on establishing connections between the interior and the exterior. This is the work of Mario Romagnach, who's really one of our outstanding tropical modern architects. Tropical modern interiors were often featuring floor-to-ceiling wood louvers, as you see here, that create privacy while allowing airflow when that's needed. And that's a return to climate-sensitive designs that had been around in Cuba for centuries. You see the beautiful woodwork that's also associated with the style, again, reminiscent of building traditions, but given a very 1950s contemporary expression. And then here we see materials like the concrete block, which are used on the exterior of the facade of this house, which are brought inside, first into the stairwell and even all the way into the dressing room of the master bedroom, in a way to establish this idea of connection between the interior and the exterior, blurring the distinctions between the inside and the outside. So this essentially is the architecture that was interrupted by the Cuban Revolution. Essentially, as Cuba's upper-class design patrons and the architects who had built the homes for them both decided to choose exile over living on the island, primarily. So now we fast forward to today, and to my upcoming book, Havana Living Today, which is essentially a portrait of the city's elite and this new entrepreneur class that we're hearing so much about. Now, when I was researching this book, I had always thought that personal expression in home decoration had pretty much disappeared at the time of the Revolution, just as essentially the construction of single-family, ground-up houses had ceased. And instead, I found dozens of houses that displayed a very authentic Cuban style that had been created within the scarcities, the constraints, and the isolation of the island's politics and economic situation. Now, many of these houses I see as scrapbooks of the memories and experiences of the people who live in them. For example, this house from the early 20th century is the home of a Cuban music and culture promoter who spends half his time in Miami, half his time in Havana. And actually, he was born in this house. I was fortunate to gain access to to Havana's diplomatic residences, including the homes of ambassadors, in this case the Norwegian ambassadors. And it's important to think about these diplomatic residences as important cultural bridges, places where Cubans are introduced to all kinds of, let's say, first world or international lifestyle and culture. Cubans are incredibly proud of their design heritage, and many of today's elite are collectors of decorative arts and furniture created in Cuba during the 19th century. This is the penthouse of a fashion designer, which is a totally over-the-top, wonderfully immersive environment that I love to visit because every time I go there, the whole thing has changed. Another of my favorites is this tropical modern house, which was built in 1955 and is owned today by the Cuban director of a British insurance agency based in Havana. As you see, it's filled with interesting furniture. I love the sort of Baroque 1950s style table base, as well as the chairs, which came from a very high-end apartment. Lots of this crowd in Havana is constantly on the search for antiques or decorative objects, and they're all trolling the number of antique stores that are found in the city. Another real favorite of mine is this mid-century home that a German-Spanish family has been renting from the state for the last 17 years. Remember, foreigners cannot own property in Cuba, so there's a state-run agency, let's say, that rents these choice houses out to them. The wife, who's German, has supervised several renovations over the past 17 years and always begins by stockpiling materials for months ahead of time before she can actually do the renovation. Remember, the lack of materials, the scarcity of them, is actually something that's daunting to Cubans. So my documenting, actually, of these stylish homes really coincided with the new authorized buying and selling of real estate, which has then given rise to private construction firms, which are quite interesting, and has actually employed lots of my architect friends as freelance designers. Cuban artists, visual artists, are an elite in that society. For years, they were allowed to sell their work to foreigners as well as to travel. And the most successful ones receive a stream of international art tourists at home galleries like this, which they have decorated simply but with great creativity in order to best show off their work. This is the living room of a Spanish architect who's been renovating hotels in Havana since the 1990s. Like all foreigners, as I mentioned, he doesn't own this. He rents it from that state agency. And actually, this is one of the few projects that I feature in the new book that was created by a professional. Pretty much everything else is do-it-yourself. Now, many people are surprised to learn that the laws permitted Cubans to own more than one home. They were allowed to own a second or beach home or a recreation home, let's call it. And recently, Havana's elite has been on the lookout for beach houses in towns that are quite close to the city, let's say half an hour, 45 minutes away, and they've been renovating, and it's all about sharing spaces like these with friends. So, whether it's a Sunday lunch that people come out to, or you come have a sunset cocktail before a night on the town, these are becoming part of the elite's usual weekend life. So I'm going to talk very briefly about the role of tourist hotels in Cuban design. Tourism is critical to the Cuban economy, and the government has announced plans to triple the number of hotel rooms in the next decade. During the so-called special period of the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed and abandoned Cuba, therefore the Cuban economy collapsed, tourism was seen as the only way out of that situation. And the Cuban government began courting a series of international hotel operators and creating a number of both urban hotels and beach resorts. The Havana hotels, like the Mallea here, which is a Spanish chain, were generally uninteresting and usually way oversized, as you see here. We've got dozens of resorts like these, which are totally what you would expect. They're found throughout the island. Many, however, are directed at this all-inclusive, low-end tourism, and essentially there are dozens of these in the works as well. What's interesting is that the tourism industry is state-run, and that in addition to providing obvious jobs, it hires thousands of Cubans in car rental agencies, marinas, shopping centers, catering facilities, printers, construction and maintenance companies. But looking at those hotels, this I contrast. The most interesting hotels really being built are the ones that are created by the Havana Historian's Office in the UNESCO-designated World Heritage Site, which is the historic core of the city. These combine elements of historic preservation with development while working with a traditional Cuban style, as you see here. The City Historian's Office is committed to preserving the local culture, as much as it is to preserving the buildings, and to keep tourism from overwhelming the neighborhoods. They're committed to creating jobs and definitely to avoiding displacement of these populations. So since the 1990s, the hotels have been providing job opportunities for most Cuban designers, including, for example, the renovation of the 3-story Saratoga that you see here into the 6-story Saratoga. So lots of these existing hotels or historic hotels have been addressed. And now there are currently a series of new hotels under construction in the city center. Contemporary designs by foreign architects, somewhat oversized, as you see here. But the fact is that they're providing the number of rooms that are needed for the Cuban government to capitalize on this wonderful moment where everybody, for all international tourism, is interested in the island. Now, I'm intrigued by the aesthetic chosen for some of these places. Here we're looking at the soon-to-open Kempinski Hotel, a city block historic structure that's been nicely renovated. It's been built to a level of quality that really doesn't exist in Cuba to this date. However, the style feels to me quite global and not particularly Cuban. Slated for renovation are landmark structures like the Riviera Hotel up there to the left and the Hotel Nacional here to the right. And these, of course, are wonderful design opportunities, yet I wonder what sort of visual identity the designers will choose for the renovations. So I'll conclude by sharing with you what I think the future is about. Design work that I find really interesting in Havana today centers pretty much around a series of new 8 to 6 room boutique hotels that have been created for high-end tourism. And in these places, I find real genuine expression of Cuban style. And what I love about them is that the best of them really connect to the neighborhood setting. They are an expression of the neighborhood setting in which you find these places. So these they're run by essentially small-scale tourism entrepreneurs who are demonstrating that if you improve the quality of what you're offering, you're going to attract a better tourist. And new businesses like these are actually responsible for enlivening some of Havana's streetscape, finally giving some personality to the city. And I don't exaggerate when I tell you that places like these are going to be transforming Havana. I'm convinced of it. So I've got a new hobby almost, which is that I'm always on the lookout for signs of change. Anything that looks fresh, like the facade of this two-story boutique hotel, catches my eye, and I research it. And I find, that this intimately scaled business, as I say, it's just 2 stories, is receiving some incredibly urbane guests whom I've met. And part of it is as a result of a very savvy international marketing campaign. And I would guarantee that 90% of residents of that neighborhood don't even know that this thing is there in their midst. Now, each new business, in my mind, brings the level of sophistication of the streetscape up, like this simple cafe that you see on the left there. And so this is an interior of that space. I'm encouraged when the owners of these new businesses recognize the importance of design to express their own identity, but also to distinguish themselves from their competition. Recently, I've begun following a little bit the vibrant contemporary design scene in Havana. And I feel that these new design entrepreneurs are also going to become catalysts for neighborhood transformation. Here I'm showing you a tattoo parlor / art gallery that's also very connected to the neighborhood children in a series of weekly programs that they run. Or here we have Clandestina, which is essentially the city's premier / only design shop, which makes nice things for Cubans as well as for tourists. And their focus, as you see here, is on recycling and sustainability, and includes an interesting T-shirt exchange program that pairs their graphic designers with members of the local community. Some places in Havana are really getting it 100% right, like this 8-bedroom La Reserva Hotel. Interestingly, the owner explained to me that he warns, he warns guests about the spotty Wi-Fi, about the inconveniences of being in Cuba, and he tells them, if you can put up with that, I guarantee you I'm going to give you the most authentic Cuban experience possible. And he says he's never had a guest complain about it afterwards. So people, as we know, are looking for those kinds of connections, and these are the places, they're looking for authenticity, and these are the kinds of places that are offering it. And so to me, the new Havana, this is the interior of that place, is about design in a historic setting. It's about using the same materials that the homeowners that I featured before are using, the clay tile floor, the colored glass, the chandeliers, all those elements, but now they're being used or in a thoroughly renovated, a brand new setting. And that's never been a feeling in Cuba. Everything's been renovations have happened piecemeal. You're making do with whatever is there. Here, everything is crisp and new. And in this case, it's got all the infrastructure to ensure that it's comfortable. And so it's interesting that just as in the 1950s, Cuban creatives can stay true to their contemporary design ideals while being inspired by the island's traditions. And so I'm finding private homes like these, again, being gut renovated, top to bottom, by professionals, and in this case for a growing number of international Cubans who spend half their time in Havana and half the time, in this case, in Soho. Talented Cuban builders are rising to the challenge, building complicated details like this outdoor spiral stair. And I'm finishing with a brand new favorite. This is a hotel / restaurant installed in a 1920s Renaissance revival house in the Vedado. A couple that owns it are Cuban-Italian. They imported all the furniture that you see from Italy. furniture and lighting. In my mind, it actually looks like mid-century Cuban furniture, so perfectly appropriate. They juxtapose it with the historic architecture. You can barely see the ceiling and the historic floors. And it's unified by a subtle color palette. Subtle is something we don't do so well there, so that's refreshing to see. And so this, to me, my last slide is really, I would say, what I think the aesthetic language of Havana of the future is all about. So it's bright, it's fresh, it's contemporary, and yet it's respectful to the historic architectural setting that's around it. I'll tell you that my new mission seems to be to help investors and Cuban designers understand the economic and the cultural benefits, or value really, of working with this rich, homegrown, authentic Cuban style. And so I thank you for giving me this opportunity to tell you a little bit of what I'm interested in. Thank you. I'd love to have some questions or people tell me about their own travel experiences to Cuba.
Hi, my name is Monica.
Hi, Monica.
I really want to thank you because you show a lot of passion about my country. I've been in all those places, I think. Yeah, thank you there. I was wondering if you have the opportunity to be in the Russian model construction we have. Like, we have a lot of,
Brigada, micro brigada.
exactly. It's kind of fascinating because you are kind of living with your neighbor.
Yeah.
And I think it was a good opportunity to bring like housing to people that didn't have enough space to live or place to live. And I was wondering why you didn't show more examples about it. I know it's not from Cuba. It's not. It was actually like a model bring from the Soviet Union and put it in there. But
So this is a type of building that was constructed. Well, I'm going to encapsulate the question. So it's a series of buildings that were built by everyday people after they finished their day job. They would become part of a construction crew, and you built a small apartment building. It's sort of sweat equity, essentially. You were creating an apartment for yourself, but you were creating something for the community. The condition of most of those places, as you see, wouldn't really fit in with the vision of Cuba that I'm showing. I am tired of decrepit, decaying, romantically whatever Cuba, and so I'm interested in you know, this stuff is not a Photoshop. This stuff is really there, and so that's sort of more my focus. But I've personally photographed lots of the micro brigada stuff because I think it's really interesting. Thank you. Yes.
We were recently in Cuba, and as an alternative to these boutique hotels, it seems that a lot of people that we met were staying at these Airbnb, which could be quite fancy, you know, include a driver, a chef, you know, $300 a night.
Yeah.
You can get a lot for that. So, you know, it's a way to accommodate all the tourism that seems to be.
Yeah. I find that most of those places leave a lot to be desired yet. They're in places where the infrastructure isn't ready to handle the visitor just quite yet, but it is a great way. You know, the travel to Cuba is supposed to be about people-to-people encounters, and you know, what better way to understand, you know, what the people are like. Yes.
I have a question, I guess, based more on your research methods. So, I'm sure
Or
you-
lack of.
Okay, well, but I'm sure you knock on a lot of doors.
I
you
did.
talk to a lot of people, especially with the vintage photographs and things like that. Did you go to University of Havana and were able to extract information there, or how easy or not easy was that to do?
The great thing was that lots of the families, excuse me, that I feature in the book shared their pictures with me. I've been to actually not the University of Havana, but the National Library with a portable scanner every time I go and scan there. But people have been very generous.
And there was, did you find a good amount of information given did people keep it, people not kept it, or?
Yeah, and I did a lot of, I mean, I didn't give you the background, but I did a lot of interviews with people. There's a, you know, if you look at these books, they're very thoroughly documented. But actually, that's what made the fun was the interaction with people who had been, it felt to me like they were waiting for somebody like me to talk to me about their reminiscences of pre-revolution Havana. So it was really moving in general. There was a lady behind you. No, that's you. Yes.
In a lot of your pictures, I saw there were a lot of classicism and
A lot of what, I'm sorry?
classicism,
Yeah.
like the columns or like the canopies, and then you had the Baroque furniture. It just seemed to be all over the place. What do you think, if you were to give your opinion, what do you think is sort of the most influential historical style that is
Well, we're eclectic. Cubans are eclectic, okay? So it's this port town where stuff is landing for hundreds of years, and you just mix it up in, at times, an irrational way, and by dint of your liking those pieces, they work together. So, I mean, I think that's just the reality of Cuba. But I think then, you know, given that, you can sort of tune it, and that would be fun to think about. Yeah.
You say you're tired of the old Cuba.
Well, none of the depictions of that. I mean, I think it's like, you know, like decay porn. Yes.
Well, in your vision of the new Cuba, with money pouring in and construction coming on, and what new hotels being built, are you not concerned that the flavor, the Havana flavor, will
Mhm.
slowly be eroded, and we'll have a, I don't know, just a world without definition.
Yeah.
You concerned
Well, that's why my interest in the little bit that I can do is tell people what you have here aesthetically in these interiors has value culturally, and you can make money off it by presenting that to tourists. So it's a form of preservation in my mind.
Do you think that will maintain? And do you think that will what you propose and provide?
I do. I think you'll lose things along the way. You know, you'll lose important buildings. You'll lose, you know, parts of neighborhoods. There are areas that are protected, but you know, there's much more areas that are not protected. So that's a fact of life. Havana's huge. The other thing is I'm showing you how the 1% live, and that I'm not showing you the 99% that, in my mind, you're already familiar with from, you know, all kinds of publications. But the people are very proud. They're very chauvinistic. They love their city, and I think they're gonna hold on. Yes.
Are you working on any projects there?
I would love to say yes, but no, we're not. First of all, legally, we apparently cannot do that. So, yeah.
Just for historical reference, architects after 1959, were they employed or controlled by the state? Did they have very little freedom?
Well, we have an expert on that topic here, but I'll just architecture in Cuba became about construction, and I think the faculty of architecture changed its name to the I don't know, it's like the School of Construction Technologies or whatever. So you work for the state. The whole prefab that came from the Eastern Bloc was idealized. So, you know, anything that felt very personal or idiosyncratic or expressive was frowned upon. And, you know, and so for a lot of these people, that's, you know, I mean, that's why the younger people who have worked in similar environments there for decades, now to be able to have a private client is just something beyond belief. What happens, though, is I think that they try to load too much onto these design projects because they've been waiting for them for, you know, 20 years. And so they get a little busy, but it's great to see that. Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of experts on post-architecture.
In your experience, it's remarkable to see in a relatively short period of time the number of architects and designers who've coalesced around these projects. In your experience talking to them, how has the education, architectural education shifted in Cuba to address it, or how do they develop their projects and maybe in spite of their educational background,
I'm not familiar with the architectural education, but I've interviewed the directors of the ISD, which is the National Design School. And it was interesting to hear them talk about their worries that young designers are getting too focused on production of things to sell to either Cubans or, tourists. And it almost felt like by soiling themselves with the details of production, they were distancing themselves from the idealized, purposes of design. And I felt very impatient with that. Because I so admire the fashion designers and shoe designers and furniture designers who are working their butts off, employing the community around them, working with materials when there are no materials, just being incredibly inventive about, recycling and repurposing and all of that, and to have someone sort of put down the efforts at the commercial aspect of design was really not appreciated.
What do you think will or nothing will happen to the housing of the 99%? I mean, it looks like there might be a continuing gap between the housing and the not.
It's just growing, that gap. Because you have to think about all these entrepreneurs that I'm talking about, essentially they're being funded, everything I'm telling you is an exaggeration, but they're being funded by family in Miami. So already there's that gap between those who have family sending them money and those that don't. I was talking to a friend just before speaking, and you get the sense that people, whereas Cubans were shyer before, or more shy about expressing their affluence or showing their affluence, now they're kind of more in your face about the gold chains or whatever, the fancy car or that kind of stuff. So I think the gap is becoming more visible. Yes.
If you are not a Cuban citizen, can you buy property there?
No. The woman asked whether if American citizens can buy property there, or essentially foreigners cannot buy property, except I think there's a couple of condominium buildings that were created specifically for foreign ownership. But what you can do is you can marry a Cuban, or you can put it in the name of a Cuban, or there's all kinds of things. I think that there are all kinds of lawsuits. I don't know about the homes. I've heard about artwork, for example, and old businesses and all, but I have not heard about the houses. The other thing is that, there's the many U.S. businesses were also seized by the government, and apparently the thinking is that first those claims have to be addressed before the sort of individual ones are going to be taken care of.
Are there any superstars
Oh, God, yeah. Okay, so Choi is, so the younger generation is, there's a guy called Orlando Inclán, and, who seems to have sewn up lots of the projects. But, yeah, they're people that are getting lots of projects. Yeah. I've really not... Oh, sorry, whether there were whether there were design stars in Cuba, and there are people that are well known, and then asked about other parts of Cuba, and I really have not. I've focused on Havana because I think it's hard enough to get around, so that's what yeah. Yes. September 26th. Thank you for the plug, David.
Could you describe basically the cycle of how they're sourcing materials, whether inland and the export, import?
It's sort of...
How are they black marketing?
That I don't know about. But, I was filming at 2 different places this past trip, and I was told twice, don't sort of shoot that because, and they didn't say why, but I asked my photographer, and he said it probably was, stolen from some construction minister or something.
But they're sourcing their paint and everything comes apparent.
Well, glass, for example, is a hugely scarce material on the island. So it's sort of like people call each other up and say, oh my God, there's a load of glass at the so-and-so hardware store, and even if you don't need it, it's like you buy sheets of glass and you put them in your backyard. It helps if you, like the fashion people, if they join these, it's not cooperatives, but some sort of government organization, for lack of a better term, that helps you get access to some of these materials. So materials are prioritized for things like the tourist industry, which actually make the country money. So if you're lucky enough to know somebody at one of those tourist construction companies and you're able to buy, again, glass, that's kind of how that happens.
So specifically for the Italian couple that imported that furniture.
But they put it all in a container, and
Hotel.
yeah, it was their hotel, and he's a diplomat, so that they have it a little bit easier. But I mean, I've seen IKEA kitchens there. Apparently now it's gotten a little harder to fill those containers. It wasn't as reasonable financially as it used to be. Stuff changes there all the time. That's the other thing. You know, you get so excited, as I am, about these new entrepreneurs, and you see them as sort of the wave of the future, and then you hear that, you know, they're having a harder time. Yeah. Yes?
In Cuba, in Havana, are the salaries paid by the government? That all money goes to the government and then they dispense money to the workers?
Apparently, that's even how it happens in the hotel industry. So it's the hotel operator pays the government the salaries, and then as you say, the government dispenses it to the employees. Yes. Oh, no, there are, well, first of all, there are cruises now going to other cities, so that's sort of putting them more on the map. Each of these cities, as I mentioned, the historian of the city of Havana, which is a very powerful historic preservation position, each of the other, let's say, 4 major cities also have a powerful person in that role. So there's been development. And then you have to remember that whole thing about those all-inclusive, that holiday town in particular, Vedado. So there's a culture of going out to those towns as well. Oh my gosh, there's great wealth of architecture. I just haven't gotten down there to work on that. Well, be happy to talk to you all afterwards as I'm signing books.
And as Hermes just said, Great Houses of Havana is available in the corner.
Yeah, and don't forget my Caribbean tome, Escape, the heyday of Caribbean glamour.